It's been a few years since I first played Alan Wake. Being a huge fan of the original game, I was ecstatic to hear about the remastered version. Naturally, I picked it up as soon as I could and dived on into this surreal and dark world of Alan Wake. Would I still like it, or was it just another figment of my nostalgic mind? Well, let's delve deeper into the darkness and find out. For those who don't know, Alan Wake is a third-person psychological horror action game, and that's a mouthful, in which you play, well, as Alan Wake, a successful writer who has been afflicted with writer's block for 2 years now. Alice, his wife, pushes him to go on some vacations to Bright Falls, a calm, secluded town to relax. But things don't go so well, and Alice is taken by a dark presence that manipulates Alan into writing a new book, where it slowly takes over everything with its darkness. After escaping, Wake starts finding pieces of his manuscript, which he doesn't remember writing, and quickly realizes that what's in the pages comes to fruition exactly as it's written. Alan then has to find out what happened to his wife, where has he been for the last week, which he doesn't really remember at all, and how to stop the dark presence from taking over everything. The game was originally an Xbox 360 exclusive, but the new remastered version is on everything under the sun except for the Nintendo Switch. The remastered version removed the product placement of the game, which it didn't really need either way, and it did some visual improvements. What didn't change was the gameplay, for better or for worse. Armed with a flashlight and a weapon, you have to traverse to various locales of the small town of Bright Falls. On the way you will fight shadow enemies, possessed ravens and poltergeists, all of which require to be brightened up with your flashlight to fight. The human enemies also need to be shot or exploded, after the light destroys their shield of darkness. Sometimes you also need to concentrate your flashlight on enemies to hurt their shield, which uses up batteries that you need to replenish. There isn't a lot of variety to the gunfights, so they can get repetitive pretty fast. I didn't really mind this too much, but the arsenal is pretty limited, and the combat encounters are way too frequent for my taste. When enemies get too close, you can do a well-timed dodge which will slow down time. Of course you can use a flare or a flashbang if you get surrounded, but those are limited, so you might as well preserve them. Running is not very viable as Alan has the stamina of a geriatrics patient. This is bad when you're trying to stay alive in combat, but fair enough. When you're outside of combat, it is a pain in the ass and makes everything much slower than it needs to be. And don't get me started on the platforming. It's not the biggest issue on the main game, but on the DLC it is absolute hell, and much more apparent how useless it was to allow you to jump at all, especially because there is almost nothing you can jump to on the main game. Well, on the DLC too, but it does contain a bit more of it. But I digress, the DLC is for later. In certain areas of the game, you can also drive. I recommend you do so as it makes not only getting to your destination faster, but also dispatching enemies, as the headlights of the car can be used to destroy the enemy's darkness shield, and after that, running them over is a surefire way to hurry things up. Combat is always set during nighttime. Taking into account who your enemies are, it's pretty normal. Sometimes, however, it will be daytime, and in these times the game takes a much slower approach. For the most part, I think the game is very well paced. However, some sections, particularly when you have these slower scenes, can drag out a little bit. Luckily, this all gets easily neglected by the fact that the narrative of the game and its side conversations are all very interesting in their own way and serve to improve the story in one way or another. This is Alan Wake's biggest strength, and to some, probably its biggest weakness. If the narrative doesn't draw you in, you will not have a good time with this game. Fortunately for me, I absolutely loved it. It's something I won't discuss much because I think if anyone has a remote interest in this game, they should absolutely not have it spoiled. It's surreal and grounded at the same time, and it always left me wondering and yearning for more at the end of every chapter. The ending was also a good conclusion that left things open for a sequel that we now know is coming, but also felt satisfactory. Also, the ending sequence is so well done and interesting. That's all I will say about it. The atmosphere is the other thing that made me fall in love with Alan Wake. Every dark place has that foreboding, oppressive atmosphere that sometimes a pitch black place has in real life. The fog and lighting truly does wonders to the visuals. I don't think I can do justice to how well the developers nail this aspect of the game, so I'll just show it to you. The soundtrack perfectly follows along as well, portraying exactly what it needs to at the right times, perfectly complementing the game in every way. Despite this being a pretty linear game, there are some parts that are a bit more open-ended, and the design and atmosphere really make you feel like exploring. Unfortunately, almost nothing of value other than scenery is found off the beaten path. This is as good as any other place to mention the abundance of useless collectibles littered throughout the game. Most likely these will be what you will find. There are way too many of them. Let me just quickly mention them so I don't feel like I wasted my time collecting them. On the better spectrum, there are the pages of Alan's manuscript which contain parts of the game that either happened or will happen. Thematically, these are wonderful, and I felt that they added to the vibe and enjoyment of the game. The radio talk shows, which I admit were not the most interesting for me, but I did enjoy them for their use fleshing out the world. The same can be said about the signs that give you lore about the town. There are also the TV show Night Springs, which was my favorite collectible. I wish there was a way to focus on them, and they are on the short side, but they are so goofy and entertaining that it doesn't really matter. Lastly, you have the weapon caches, which are useful because, well, you know, they resupply your resources. On the other side, there are the not so good ones, which are the can pyramids and the coffee thermoses. Doesn't really sound too bad, right? Well, I kind of forgot to mention that there are 100 coffee thermoses to collect. These don't give you anything, and they don't help the world building or the plot in any way. They are just a waste of time. Sure, you don't have to get them, but if you decide to do it, then be warned that you will get nothing but a trophy out of it. This means there are more than 200 collectibles across the main game, which in my opinion is way too much for any game, let alone a narrative-driven game. Before we get into the DLC itself, I want to briefly mention a few miscellaneous little things. The remastered version looks superb and runs very well. However, the humans look a bit plasticky and the lip syncing seems to not be right sometimes. And in specific, on a bridge on chapter 6, the game felt like it was going to explode on me, dropping frames like nowhere else. Happened twice and then it stopped, so I don't really know if it was a me thing or a common issue. I love there are quite a few menu options to choose from. This is something that only recently started being talked about, but I very much appreciate. Just a simple option to make subtitles bigger can be a game changer for someone. You can also choose to have director's commentary on, both for the original game or for the remastered version. And then came the DLC, starting with The Signal. I'll be very blunt. I enjoyed the story and the level design, but I hated the bigger emphasis on combat. As I said before, it didn't bother me much, but Alan Wake's combat is not its strongest suit. It can be fun in doses. However, in more claustrophobic locales with much more reduced resources, the game becomes a bit of a nightmare to play. At first, I was regretting starting The Signal up, but as it went on, it got better. The other DLC, The Rider, was much better. The resources and combat sections are much better paced and balanced, and I never felt like any part was way too difficult or unfair, unlike on The Signal. The level design and story are once again the highlight, with The Rider being a much bigger improvement on both ends to the previous DLC. They are both very much worth your time, and since they follow each other, you should really not skip either. Although, if you do want to skip them, you might as well just skip both. It's not like you lose that much because it only fills in gaps. It doesn't actually do much, I guess, with the story. It just fills in some gaps and makes the ending a bit less broad. I will say, even though The Rider has very interesting and creative places, they can also be extremely frustrating. Take for instance the rotating house. If you want the collectible, you have to jump on top of it while it rotates. Sometimes Alan doesn't jump when you want him to, plus he jumps like a man with no knees, let's be honest. So when I got there, I just wanted to get it done. So I jumped out and died. Little did I know, the game had checkpointed me, so I just got stuck in a death loop of which I couldn't escape. So I had to restart the entire DLC. But the worst offender is... you know what? The DLC is short enough, I won't spoil it. But be warned, when shit rotates, it sucks real bad, always. The insistence on some of the platforming was also not appreciated, but honestly, this goes for every part of the game. I mean, the jump is so useless, I feel like they could have just removed it from the game. Nevertheless, 11 years later, and I still love this game for the same reasons I did when I first played it. The story is incredibly well written, the atmosphere is phenomenal, the music is a perfect company piece to the entire game. Sure, not everything was as perfect as I remembered it, mainly the combat and the amount of collectibles, but I urge you to try this game. Alan Wake is like no other. If the sequel has the same amount of love and attention as this one, I for one can't wait to see Return by Alan Wake.
My name is Alan Wake, and I'm a writer.
And with that, I end my review of Alan Wake Remastered. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, leave a like. If not, leave a dislike and let me know how I can improve. Next up will most likely be Moonlighter, so I hope to see you there.